I want to introduce our second panel. The title of the panel is A Crucial Role of Language and Area Studies in Maintaining Strong International Ties. We have a distinguished group of experts. Our panel moderator is Dr. Dan Davidson, who is President Emeritus and co-founder of American Councils for International Education. Dr. Davidson has dedicated his career to promoting effective language learning, study abroad, and cultural exchange. He has been instrumental in shaping U.S. and international language education policy and fostering global ties through language and area studies programs. Also joining us, Dr. Michael Nugent, the former director of the Defense Language and National Security Education Office. Under his leadership, that office played a pivotal role in building language and cultural expertise among U.S. students to support national security needs. His insights into the intersection of language skills and global security are sure to enrich our conversation today. We're also pleased to introduce Dr. Sydney, not doctor yet, almost. A little bit of work. Ms. Sydney Stotter, a PhD candidate in Slavic languages and literatures at Harvard University. As a rising scholar with a passion for language and area studies, Sydney's research focuses on the politics of historical memory, film, and literature of the Second World War. She represents the next generation of experts and is herself an alumna of the flagship program. We're also pleased to welcome Ambassador John Ordway, a trustee of American Councils for International Education. Ambassador Ordway is a retired U.S. diplomat with extensive experience in Russia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Armenia. His deep understanding of the geopolitical landscape, coupled with his commitment to language and area studies, makes him a valuable voice on this panel. And Betty Lever, is she with us? Okay. And virtually, somewhere, we have Dr. Betty Lou Lever, former provost of the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center, one of the world's premier institutions of foreign language instruction. With decades of experience in language pedagogy, Dr. Lever has trained thousands of military and government personnel in critical languages, shaping the form of that training and playing a key role in preparing government and military staff for international assignments. Turn it over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm honored to be here today and to be joined by this distinguished panel of experts on a subject that we believe is very much worth the kind of deep dive. We've talked a lot so far about the mission of public diplomacy, and you can see the coherence between the work overseas and the engagement of foreign publics. But the other part of that equation is American readiness and American preparation, our own nation's capacity to engage appropriately in the many challenges that the world presents today. American Councils is well known in the intercultural studies field for its pioneering language and cultural immersion programming. That's what we're going to be talking about today. What makes this program different? Our emphasis for the last 50 years has been to complement the good work of the centers and academic and public programs in this country in language through overseas immersion enhancement. Enhancement normally takes the form of a semester, an academic year in the target language country. Now, why is this so important? I want to quote my colleague and co-founder, Dr. Brecht, on this subject. Dick explained to us in the 1970s that why study abroad works, often having the transformational effect that it does. Why does that? Why is it so unusually powerful? And Dick responded, well, it's rich, it's real, and it's relevant. It's the real life immersion for our students in that target culture. But to work effectively, it must also be safe, it must be inclusive, and it must be linguistically and culturally attuned to the level of learning and developmental needs of the Americans going overseas. This is not definitely a case of sink or swim. Overseas immersion training needs to be managed with the same enormous care that any other serious learning and educational activity should be. I believe that, in some ways, is the contribution of American Council's overseas training programs over these last 50 years, is to sort of figure out the design and how to manage that. Student mobility is not new. It's as old as the modern university itself, although I must say the medieval wandering student had the advantage of Latin, where we no longer have that lingua franca at our hands. The language immersion student undergoes a process of continued socialization in the host country culture, during which they try to maintain their first language and cultural identities and beliefs while developing the skills to interact effectively and appropriately with people of different or divergent affective, cognitive, and behavioral orientations toward the world. That process is always challenging, both cognitively and emotionally for the learner, but it can also be transformative, and it's an expression, by the way, often used by our alumni and their teachers and parents sometimes when they return, the transformative experience of overseas life. We're going to interrogate that question a bit, we have Dr. Betty Lever on this panel a bit later who will address that issue of transformative learning. Immersion students quickly come to appreciate the broad range of communicative tasks that bilinguals can accomplish, many of which have much less to do with the transfer of information and much more to do with the establishing or maintaining a relationship, something we keep talking about here today. Understanding unspoken social hierarchies. Who talks to whom about what? Comprehending how things work in the host culture. And most importantly, building trust. American Council's overall portfolio of funded and tuition-based immersion study programs for Americans overseas operate today in Central Asia, in all the countries of Central Asia, in India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, the Middle East, North Africa, the South Caucasus, Southern Europe, Southeast Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Taiwan, Thailand, Turkey, and Vietnam. That was alphabetical. The academics in us won't ever go away. This history would never have been possible without the leadership and support of many individuals and government organizations represented at today's conference, here in this room and online. American Council's benefited early on from the support of the U.S. Department of State and its principal cultural diplomat of the Cold War era, the late Yale Richmond, who funded and participated personally in that inaugural conference in Boston that took place exactly in this middle week of October in 1974, 50 years ago. The Department of State remains the organization's principal funder and partner to this day. And we'll be hearing more about that connection with the State Department from Ambassador John Ordway later in this panel. In 1980, the U.S. Department of Education's respected Fulbright-Hays Group Projects Abroad program became also a major funder of American Council-sponsored overseas study, followed in 1983 by the State Department's newly inaugurated Title VIII Soviet and East European Research and Training Programs at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR, which provides fellowships both for advanced language training and also for on-site collaborative research, archival studies, and field work for qualified American graduate students and area scholars at all levels. That program continues to generate a lively flow of original policy-relevant research on East Europe, Russia, Eurasia, as well as Southeast Europe, produced by both early career and senior scholars. American Councils and the community more generally owes a debt of gratitude to former Congressman David Obey for his steadfast support of language and area studies legislation, such as Title VI, Fulbright-Hays, and Title VIII. Similarly, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Senator Bill Bradley and Congressman Jim Lynch led the effort to pass the Freedom Support Act, FSA, which, from the point of view of our discussion today, created for the first time an enormous reciprocal flow of high school students, think of the FLEX program, also university students, graduate students, scholars, and young professionals during the 1990s. For the first time, the programs, the large numbers of students and scholars we were sending abroad were being matched and exceeded by incoming students of the same level. That was an excitement. It was also a dream for American councils. Senators Kennedy and Lugar later emulated the model of Senators Bradley and Lynch in developing the YES program after 9/11 in creating possibilities for engaging the Muslim world. And I want to also mention Senator Ted Stevens and the late Jim Billington, the late Senator Ted Stevens, were creating about that same time the Open World program, another very important visitor program. Now, the tragedy of 9/11 and the conflicts that followed brought home to U.S. policymakers in a way that previous events somehow had not, the reality of the threat to U.S. national security posed by the staggering shortfall across all federal agencies in personnel competent in critical languages and strategic world areas. Retired Major General Robert Scales, the distinguished military historian, noted in 2006, and I'll quote, "In the Iraq wars, a curtain of cultural ignorance continues to separate the good intentions of the American soldier from indigenous peoples of goodwill. Inability to speak the languages and insensitive conduct have become real combat vulnerabilities, which our enemy has been quick to exploit." Following a series of hearings, the House Armed Services Committee reached the conclusion that the serious deficit of language skills and cultural expertise in the military is not just the military's problem. It's a problem for the United States overall, particularly attention and capacity in the less commonly taught languages. As that report noted, quote, "Professional level language, culture, and area skills are no longer a, quote, nice to have, unquote, nor are they necessary only for a handful of senior analysts and diplomats. These skills save lives." And in January 2006, President Bush announced the creation of the National Security Language Initiative, NSLI, quote, "to dramatically increase the number of Americans learning critical need foreign languages." Complementing the existing network of Title VI centers, the National Security Language Initiative, or NSLI program, sponsored by the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, might be likened to a kind of dedicated elevator for learners of critical languages, with multiple access points from absolute beginners to advanced level pre-professionals, from 15-year-olds to graduate students. NSLI programs are competitive and open to students of all social, economic, institutional, and academic backgrounds. Language and cultural instruction within them is delivered in multiple ways: online, domestic intensive, overseas summer, or year-long overseas immersion. American Councils is honored to have worked closely with the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs in the administration of the NSLI Y program since its inception, and in the study of Arabic, Chinese, Hindi, Korean, Persian, Russian, and Turkish. As a faculty member at Bryn Mawr for many years, I also had the privilege of teaching graduates of the NSLI Y program as they would continue their language study. They go on to college with their language. Most of them in my program were taught at least at the 300 level. That's the upper level where students do the work already in the target language. Entering freshmen, not bad. The Critical Language Scholarship Program accepts undergraduate and graduate students across disciplines for one of its 15 overseas summer intensive programs. Since its inception, CLS boasts 9,000 alumni, many of whom are now advanced level speakers of language, including Arabic, Bahasa, Bangla, Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, Korean, Persian, Portuguese, Brazilian, Punjabi, Russian, Swahili, Turkish, and Urdu. It's still alphabetized. NSLI Y and CLS also offer online programs. I mean, it's really exciting. Virtual NSLI Y and CLS Spark have created many hundreds of additional opportunities each year for the study of critical languages in locations and for populations that have never had such access before. Finally, the department's high-profile Flex and Yes programs, I just mentioned, those sort of the big freedom support era programs that brought young people this way from our target countries, also became reciprocal and are supporting exchange opportunities for American high school students to live and study in these critical regions of the world. The Capstone Language Flagship Program, think of this as the top floor on that elevator. accepts undergraduate students nominated by domestic flagship programs, who can demonstrate advanced level proficiency in their chosen critical language at the time of application, and then trains those students at overseas university partners to level 3, to superior proficiency or higher. The professional level of proficiency required by key language designated positions in the federal government. That's that gap we've been talking about. Over the past 20 years, the capstone programs have produced a robust flow of high-functioning bilinguals, BA graduates in Arabic, Chinese, Korean, Persian, Portuguese, and Russian, graduates well prepared to meet the requirements of entry-level positions in government, the military, business, or graduate school, and with superior levels of linguistic, cultural, and regional knowledge. We will be hearing shortly from the immediate past director of the Defense Language National Security Office, and we will also hear from one of the graduates of that program, Mike and Sydney. In closing, American Councils is honored to have contributed over the course of the past 50 years to somehow, to some degree, strengthening U.S. capacity in international affairs through the preparation of successive generations of American citizens with high levels of competency in the world's critical languages and cultures. Individuals who have gone on to use their language and area study skills to advance mutual understanding, strengthen U.S. national security, and ensure that U.S. decision makers, whether in government, business, academia, or elsewhere, are guided by a more nuanced and multifaceted understanding of the social, historical, and political contexts surrounding today's global and international issues. Thank you. Now, Mike Nugent has the floor.
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me? Great. By the way, Sydney was the graduate, not me, of those programs. It's a huge honor to be here, especially on a panel with the co-founder of American Councils. Now, I could say so much and cover probably hours of discussion on this topic, but because we have a big screen here with a countdown thing, and I'm very conscious I want to leave time for my colleagues, I will really focus on some of the contributions that American Councils made to some of the efforts that we worked on, and leave it at that. But just keep in mind, I'm leaving out so much, unfortunately, given the time constraints. Now, like many of you here, or some of you, I should say, I was at the 25th anniversary, and at that time, that was 25 years ago, I was a program officer at the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, and I was working on an innovative project called RusNet. And RusNet was this idea that Masha Lekic, who was the program director at the time, and Ken Peterson, I think is over there someplace, there he is. They had this idea, working with Dan, about trying to transform the field of Russian by using a very new technology called the internet. And, so by getting involved with this project, I suddenly saw the insides of what I thought was a really innovative organization. I mean, these guys had this can-do attitude. Everything was about innovation. And as I saw things, I saw they were about trying to work across institutions and across the field to try to solve a major problem. That was how to improve Russian language learning. And that was 1998. Today, RusNet still lives on, and I will talk about that in just a second. But after I left FIPSI, I took on the role of managing the Title VI National Resource Centers, Language Resource Centers, and some of the Fulbright-Hays programs. And I was happy to hear today that some of those Fulbright-Hays programs, I suddenly, again, saw what American Councils could do. They stood above a lot of the other programs in making sure that they reached the highest levels of proficiency and actually measured them as well. So again, American Council shined. But it wasn't until 2007 when I joined the National Security Education Program, first as deputy director and then later as director, that I really saw what they could do. Now, the David L. Boren National Security Education Act of 1991 was brought into being in order to create a cadre of American graduates who could then work in government service that had the skills, the language skills and cultural skills and area study skills that was needed. And it was to complement what the Title VI programs are doing, but really in these cases, flagship, which Dan had just talked about, was about focusing on undergraduate studies. Now, we created over the years since I was there an entire suite of programs to serve some of the needs that we're talking about today, but I'm just going to focus on one program because I think in that case, American Council's really made a difference. And that was, as Dan pointed out, to create a program that created professional proficiency in their graduates of students of all majors. So this was a very novel idea. You go to university as an undergraduate, you study languages, and you get out of college with the ability to actually use the language in employment. And strangely enough, this had never been really done before, especially not at this level, at this scale. Our charge was clear at the time. That was to expand the number of institutions greatly across the United States to get a whole bunch of different institutions involved in this. It was also to make sure that we only focused on undergraduates, which wasn't always the typical way of dealing with language instruction in the United States, but we wanted to push it down to the undergraduate level, and we wanted to make sure there were a lot of undergraduates involved. And so that was a big challenge for us. Now, expanding the stateside part was a real challenge. We're going to transform how we did things, and we have a lot of folks in the room that were involved with that, and I thank you all. Many thought this was impossible. But we had, by the time we were in the throes of things, Dan, I think we had over 1,000 people working worldwide here in the United States on this project. Now, of course, I don't have time to discuss all of the innovations we did, but let me focus on just 3 aspects of what American Council did to help us. First, as Dan alluded to, we had an overseas capstone program that was unique to none others. The overseas capstone program, will use the St. Petersburg program in Russia as an example that, again, Masha helped set up over there. This program was designed to take students in at the ILR, or the Interagency Language Roundtable level of 2. So that's what they needed as a minimum to get into the program during their undergraduate studies when they went to Russia and later on to places like, well, in the early years we had Alexandria, Egypt, and Syria, places like that. But they needed to get to that level as a minimum before they went on to their overseas program, at which point they would finish at an ILR 3, which is professional proficiency. And by the way, ILR 2 is way beyond what most undergraduate majors end up in their language when they're done studying their studies. Now, the purpose of the overseas centers was really to, as I said before, to get to the superior level, but we were going to do that in a lot of different ways. First off, we needed to set up programs that had homestays. And so American Council's, given their experience of having worked across Eastern Europe in the years preceding flagship, they had a lot of experience in helping us do that. And so we set up programs that had, first off, we had to find staffing and teaching staff. We had to train them how to do this. Nobody had done this before. We also had internships that we created for these students. They were also mandated to direct enroll in the institutions in country. For example, in St. Petersburg State, the students would take courses at the university in the language alongside Russian students, or in Egypt alongside the Egyptian students. And over time, they were also mandated to work at the same time in the language with internships. So this is all stuff that American Councils set up for us as a model that then spread across our flagship languages that Dan just mentioned. So this was no small feat in setting this up. At the same time, we were setting up these programs stateside. But American Councils really showed its value when things politically went a little bit it went the wrong way that we wanted it to go. Let's just put it that way. And in some cases, in the throes of chaos, they were able to move these programs almost overnight to places like Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Meknes, Morocco, for example. The second major area that was extremely important for us was that we said we were a proficiency-based program, but we really didn't have a testing process that worked in the academic environment. Of course, they had government tests like the Defense Language Proficiency Test, but those weren't easily used within the academic enterprise. So given the fact that we needed these really quickly, we made a bunch of grants to a bunch of different organizations saying, please come back to us with tests in the following languages, and we gave American Councils one for Russian, and we gave some other folks ones for the other languages. Well, after a year, American Councils, guess what? They were the only group that had something that worked. And everybody else was still conceptualizing. And so we decided to go with American Councils for all of them. And guess what really helped them? It was RusNet, right? The FIPSI project that we had funded years before helped them give an infrastructure that allowed them to do this sort of thing. The third contribution, and last contribution I'm going to talk about today, was something where I realized that showing people test scores like ILR3 or an ACTFL score doesn't really say much to people who aren't language professionals or sometimes inside government. So we started something called the Video Project, where we actually videotape students making presentations, just like we've all been doing today, in the target language, and then taking questions from the audience in Russian or in Arabic or in Chinese. And that is a huge library that they set up now that we can show to anybody. And unfortunately, we do not have time, but they are really worth watching. Now, today, the flagship program has really proven that we can do this. We've now graduated thousands of students with the professional proficiency level in speaking, reading, and listening. And note I say we, I mean we in the sense of we, the American people, because I am no longer there, but my colleagues are doing a great job of continuing this on. These graduates have proven themselves to be amazing. And I would say also this, it's not just about the fact that these students can leave these programs and go right into work and use the language in the workplace. It's also really important that these students have really transformed overseas and have really lived in homestays. They've been able to understand the cultures from where they are, and in that way they come back and they are able to work with people different from themselves. In other words, they make really good public servants, and they make really good human beings. And we will be hearing from one of those graduates, Sydney Stotter, who finished the flagship program in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and she'll be talking a little bit about that as well. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be here and to have been given the opportunity to reflect on my time as a student. And as Dr. Nugent said, I'll be speaking primarily about my experience on the Russian Overseas Flagship Program in Almaty in 2017 and 2018. But I'm actually an alum of 3 American Councils programs, including RLASP and the Balkan Language Initiative. And in thinking about my time as a student of foreign languages, as a student of Russian, my time as a student has coincided with some pretty significant historical and geopolitical inflection points, because I entered my first year as an undergraduate at Bryn Mawr College in the fall of 2013. I was studying Russian for the first time, and I was already very interested in the idea of this flagship program when, in the spring of my first year, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and occupied eastern Ukraine. And at that point, it was announced that the flagship program would be moving from its location in St. Petersburg to Almaty. And I want to say, from the perspective of a student, you don't have that much access to what's going on behind the scenes, but from that position, it was always very clear from the program administration that this was not to be treated as some kind of crisis or a great loss for students, but that it was, in some sense, a great opportunity, that you would still be receiving the same kind of very rigorous language training that we would have in St. Petersburg, while also getting a chance to be exposed to another culture, another Russophone place. And so I was very excited for that opportunity. And of course, I did get to study with RLASP for 1 semester in St. Petersburg. That is what prepared me and got me to ILR level 2 in Russian and made me ready to go on flagship, which was, as Dr. Davidson said, a transformative, very important year in my life, not just because of the language training that I did, which did allow me to reach ILR level 3, but again, also as a person. And I think two of the components that were very important to me were, as Dr. Nugent said, the direct enrollment course. I was taking a graduate level course, something I had never done before, either in English or in Russian, alongside local students. I was taking a course on sociolinguistics and the language politics of Kazakhstan. So I was going to the lectures in Russian. I was meeting and interacting with local students who were sharing their knowledge and expertise with me. And at the same time, I was also engaging in this really interesting meta-discourse about the place of Russian in this country. And it was already in 2017 a big point of conversation and in flux. And I learned a lot from that experience, as well as from the internship that I did in the spring semester. I had this internship at a television production company in Almaty, which was so interesting. It introduced me to a lot of really fascinating topics of conversation related to the media landscape in the post-Soviet and post-socialist world, the way that these media professionals, journalists, were working under increasingly constrained conditions. Mm-hmm. And so both the experience of the direct enrollment and of the internship would go on to shape some of my academic and research interest in graduate school, which is something I will plan to talk about a bit in the end. But probably the most important component of my time in Almaty was the homestay. I lived with actually a history professor at the university that I was studying at, and with her family. And she's an amazing person. I still have a good relationship with her today, more than 5-6 years after I finished the program. And so I was exposed to a lot of really fascinating conversations about Kazakh history, about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which she taught to her own students, both in Russian and in Kazakh at the university. And alongside that, I was also getting exposed to a lot of wonderful cultural experiences. She brought me to her mother's 75th birthday party. She brought me to a family wedding in Shymkent, which is an experience I could never have even, sort of imagined possible before. And I heard a lot of both Russian and Kazakh at that wedding. And I think, so that was, one of the most important and transformative relationships that I developed while I was there. And I finished the program. I went on to work in American Councils for 2 years with the flagship program, as well as briefly with Nestle Y. And then I started graduate school. I have done a master's, and I'm now in a PhD program. And it was really at that point that I understood fully how unique and how important it was to have had the flagship experience as an undergraduate. I think that flagship made me both a very successful candidate to graduate school and also allowed me to be successful in my graduate programs. I think the majority, if not all other non-native speakers of Russian who arrived at these graduate programs had to do additional coursework in Russian language once they were in the master's or PhD program, and I did not. I immediately, in my master's, started studying Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian, and in just 2 or 3 years, I reached an advanced level in BCS. And I had the wonderful opportunity to do a FLAS summer fellowship in Bosnia the summer before last. And it was the experience of having such a strong foundation in another Slavic language that allowed me to attain a high level of working proficiency in BCS. And now I have 2 research languages that I work in on a daily, weekly basis. So that's a very important part of my story as well. I'm very attached to BCS in addition to Russian now. And as a graduate student, I spent the first 2 years of my PhD doing coursework. And now in my 3rd year, this has been a really wonderful opportunity to reflect on my history as a student, not just because of the American Council's 50th anniversary, but because I'm in my first semester of teaching Russian to undergraduates as well as graduate students. And something that I've found so pleasantly surprising and wonderful is that the majority of my students now are coming to the study of Russian not with the express goal of speaking Russian in Russia, but with the desire to use Russian in other countries as well. I have 2 students in their first year of college who are in Army ROTC. They're already very excited about Project Go and using their Russian in Latvia next summer. I have graduate students who want to be conducting research in archives in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, who are bringing other types of language experience with them to Russian. And so this experience of over a decade as a student affiliated with American Councils and now as a teacher, I'm just immensely grateful for this opportunity that I can really turn and use to give to my students who are just beginning this hopefully long journey in studying Russian and becoming a generation of professionals and members of a community who have that experience as well. So thank you very much.
Splendid. Thank you, Sydney. Our next speaker is Betty Lou Lever, recent provost of the Defense Language Institute and also a faculty member at FSI. Betty Lou will be appearing audio only and by Zoom, so stand by.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the lack of video. Here in the California Central Coast Hills, I have to choose between video or audio. I think my voice is better than my face in this case. But as Dan noted in his talk, I will focus on transformation and cross-cultural learning experience. But first, in terms of importance, while they may not be entirely visible to the non-government world, and even within the government world may be sporadic and disconnected, language and culture have been, continue to be, and seem projected to be increasingly significant in both government language programs, where the emphasis is on foreign language proficiency, which is impeded without knowledge of culture, and government culture programs, which likewise are impeded without knowledge of language. This significance has long been recognized by U.S. government language and culture programs, and increasingly beyond, and has engendered a growing body of research as well as efforts at determining how to measure what is now called LREC, Language, Regional Expertise, and Culture. Recently, a colleague, Dr. Muwafaq Al-Anasi of the Naval Postgraduate School, and I investigated this significance in a survey on leadership values conducted with representatives from 4 groups. 1, Americans serving in senior leadership positions in Russia. 2, Russians serving in senior leadership positions in the U.S. 3, Americans serving in senior leadership positions in Arab countries. And 4, Arabs serving in senior leadership positions in the U.S. All respondents pointed out the importance of understanding the other culture and its language in order to perform well or even adequately. Most had encountered some kind of obstacle in doing so. Those who had limited language and culture preparation pointed out the ways in which such instruction is critical and would have made their experiences more comfortable and their work efforts more viable. This study will be included in 2 chapters in a forthcoming book from West Point Press titled Language, Regional Expertise, and Culture, LREC, State of the Science, edited by Jeffrey Watson and colleagues at U.S. Military Academy. In addition to solidifying in print the general state of the field of LREC programs, the book contains several chapters on the importance of LREC competence for national leaders in military, diplomatic, and academic positions. From my perspective, based on broad experience with LREC needs across government agencies, if it has 3 letters in its acronym and a language interest, chances are I have worked with that agency in some capacity over the past 30 years. So the way to achieve the needed competence most reliably, quickly, and deeply is through programs that are transformative in nature. Transformative Language Learning and Teaching, TLLT, which is, by the way, the title of a Cambridge-published book co-edited by Dan Davidson, Christine Campbell, and myself, pulling in experiences of leading scholars across academia and government programs, is a paradigm shift from current proficiency orientations. While not discounting the importance of proficiency, TLLT moves the goalposts from improved language use to a personal change in perspective, the appearance of sociolinguistically appropriate language, and development of a comfort level with the other, thus raising the goals of language and culture programs to striving for the creation of a bilingual, bicultural product, which includes level 4 language proficiency. I am never letting go of that level 4. On the other hand, TLT is really old.
Produce a few, right?
As old as the best of the study abroad programs. By best, I refer to those programs that did and do incorporate LREC in a way that causes learners to change their perspectives or reframe their understanding of an intuitive interaction with the other. Among the best examples, in my opinion, are the many study abroad programs conducted by the American councils over the years, the majority of which include life-changing homestays. I suppose I might appear biased since American councils, I have to share this. I might appear biased because American councils facilitated the opportunity for me to earn my PhD in applied linguistics at Pushkin Institute in Moscow, which was definitely a transformative experience. But I am pretty confident that I'm being objective. As DLI's provost, I was associated with programs in 63 languages and their efforts to build LREC expertise, sometimes using study abroad or immersion efforts, and other times not. I have also seen American Council's programs in action, including a joint DLI and American Council's program at the University of Kharkiv, a program that was not located in the university. I mean, current news, brings Kharkiv to mind every day. A program that was not located in the university's language department, but in the University of Kharkiv School of International Studies, where DLI students took courses alongside their university counterparts and were quite surprised at the kind of academic work expected, the high school preparation of their counterparts for such work, and for their own, in too many cases, inadequate preparation, not linguistically, but academically. Being embedded into these kinds of uncomfortable, unexpected, minimally prepared for situations is what creates a disorienting dilemma, a term used in transformative education to indicate an emotionally soaked cognitive conflict that demands resolution. The resolution generally results in a changed person, someone with a new perspective, hence the term transformative learning. I would note importantly the comment Dan made earlier. Transformed learners do not abandon their own culture, but blend into it a deep understanding and acceptance of their new culture. Learners participating in transformative learning experiences have reached higher levels of language proficiency than their peers. There's a growing body of statistics that shows this, sometimes a full proficiency level higher, even more, in the same length of study. Likely, were we able to test cultural expertise in a similar fashion, the results would show an even more pronounced difference. But until we have a valid and reliable measurement tool, and we're working on that, we can only observe and estimate that there is indeed great and measurable growth. Can this be done digitally? That was one of the questions that was posed to the panel earlier. Yes, but not as certainly. The Novomova School in Kiev, Ukraine conducted short-term immersion programs for DLI's Russian and Ukrainian students assigned to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency that were highly effective. First COVID and then the war took away the ability of Novomova to conduct in-country programs. And the school moved to the internet, using the same approach and instructors and many of the same practices adapted for digital delivery. Results in the area of language proficiency, cultural expertise, or transformation have not yet been measured, as far as I know. And can this be done in the classroom? Yes, but not as certainly. State Department has done it in the past with its advanced program in selected languages, including Russian, and with selected students. DLI has also done it with selected programs. It is more difficult in the classroom, but open architecture curricular design, which is a non-textbook, adaptive content, learner-involved approach associated with TLLT, provides a mechanism for transformative learning in the classroom. I would concede by responding directly to one of the questions that was posed to panelists prior to this conference, sorry. How can language and area studies programs better demonstrate their relevance and value to students, particularly in an era of increasing focus on career-oriented education? My answer would be that these are not disconnected concepts. In an increasingly global world, LREC programs are career-oriented education. Just ask the NASA astronauts and cosmonauts on the International Space Station crews who trained jointly in both the US and Russia back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for 5 years, whose lives, let alone career success, depend on their language and cultural competence. With that, I look forward to continued language and area studies efforts, leveraging cooperation among government, academic, and private enterprises, and an increased awareness at senior policymaker levels of the potency for such efforts to improve the global geopolitical climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It was actually a great pleasure to hear Betty, and a great disappointment not to see her in person, because she was the language training supervisor for my year of studying Russian at the Foreign Service Institute. Let me just start a little bit. First of all, I'm not involved in any way as either a provider or a recipient of American Council's language, area studies, all those other things. I will go through and describe a bunch of languages that I have studied and tried to learn, and then try to talk a little bit about how I used them and how important they were in both my own personal work as a diplomat and for the U.S. government and for the U.S. people in carrying out the mission that the embassies do abroad. So first of all, my list of languages. So the first language I studied was Spanish. I started in the 4th grade. I studied Spanish in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. And in the 10th grade, I got to 2nd year Spanish. But there's a reason why, which is they did not have native language and culture instructors. Yeah. They had regular classroom teachers who were doing their best to teach you. And we had each year new students who had no Spanish, so we always had to start all over again from scratch. Second language I studied was Italian, and this was in university. I had 3 or 4 quarters of Italian. I went to Stanford's program in Italy, spent 6 months in Florence with intensive language and regular classes and lots of immersion in the culture. I later went back, studied some more Italian as an undergraduate, and finished off my 4 years at Stanford with another 3 months at Stanford in Italy. So I had a lot of Italian, and I really did learn to get to use that and be able to communicate and use it in almost any fashion. And it's always come back to me when I've come back to Italy. So that was one, unlike Spanish, that I actually took. Obviously, I'm a sucker for languages. So I went back to Stanford and took German. And took a few quarters of German, learned basic German. When I was after college traveling around Europe for a while, I spent 2 months in Vienna, took some courses there for a few hours a day. And my basic German is very good, but never really got beyond like, where is the train station? Then
we can say that.
We come to perhaps the most difficult language I've ever tried to master, which is Czech. And I had 44 weeks at the Foreign Service Institute. I went off and spent 3 years in Prague. I achieved a very high rating of success in that language, and it has more or less stuck with me. I will get back to that when I tell a few other anecdotes. Then I had Russian, which is where I met Betty. And through a combination of circumstances, I managed to get, for those of you who know the language scores, from 0, 0 to 4, 4 in 44 weeks, which I still can't believe looking back on it. But I then proceeded to use that language professionally abroad for 16 years. So it was a great investment of the U.S. government's resources to spend that time teaching me Russian, because I really did get to use it in a variety of countries, in a variety of scenarios, and Russian is my best language today, I believe. Then I took French. Not my most successful language, although I did get the basic professional competence, but I never felt real confident in it. And unlike my other Foreign Service Institute languages, when I actually went overseas to use it, I was at the U.S. mission to NATO, where I only used it passively. So my French is, I always defer to my brother, who's much better in French if we're traveling. Then we come to another odd group of languages. When I got to Armenia, I could use the Russian, but I couldn't read the street signs. So I decided I was going to try to take Armenian from the post-language program where they spend a couple of hours a week teaching in a classroom. And my Armenian got to the point where I could do a lot of basic stuff. I could say, Haikakan search aran shakari, which means Armenian coffee without sugar, because I can't stand coffee with sugar, and that's how they served it. So I got some useful phrases. And I got to the point where I could generally figure out what it was they were talking about and occasionally pick up errors in translation. And sort of the same thing happened when I went to Almaty in Kazakh. I spent actually a number of years, 3 or 4 years total, of doing the same thing an hour or two a day. And my Kazakh got to the point where I could actually read basic speeches, communicate sort of basic sort of politeness things, but really couldn't use it for any sort of a formal conversation or anything beyond that. Then I went to Bulgaria, and I studied Bulgarian again with the teacher. Never really got to the point where I could speak much of it, but I definitely improved my understanding based on my other Slavic languages. And then finally, although I never studied, I do have to mention Ukrainian, because I spent 8 months in Kiev, and I decided I wasn't going to study Ukrainian because it was never going to get that good, and it was going to ruin both my Russian and my Czech. So instead, I used my knowledge of Russian and Czech to understand Ukrainian at a pretty good level, and do what a lot of Russian speakers in Ukrainian do, is they listen to the questions. They have part of the conversation coming in Ukrainian, you answer back in Russian. And so I sort of fit right in perfectly. Anyway, 10 languages. So how do you use them, and why do you use them? What is the purpose of all this money and effort and so forth? Well, I think above all, it is for understanding. When you go and you are living and working abroad, whatever it is, whether it's a tourist or a long-term diplomat or a businessman, the most important thing is to understand the country you are there, where you are. And with that language, it gives you the tool you need in order to understand what's going on, what's happening around you. Second one is context. The combination of language and cultural studies and your ability to use the language provide you the context in which you are operating. Make sure you don't do anything egregiously wrong. You don't step outside the norms. You don't become, not coin a phrase, an ugly American abroad. Exactly. Another thing that you use it to do, and this is really important if you're in the business of being a diplomat, is getting information. Reliable information that's accurate, that's not coming through parties who may want to twist it. So if you're going to write reports that are going to end up on the Secretary of State's desk, you want to make sure they are accurate, that they have the right information. And your language skills help give you much greater confidence that the information you are providing back to those people in Washington is accurate. Then we get to one of the most important ones, and that's relationships. Being able to communicate in a foreign language allows you to build relationships that otherwise are impossible to create, either the depth or the breadth of those relationships. It really does give you that essential tool without which you cannot do your job of building relationships, of trying to understand people and convince people or transmit to them in ways they can understand what the U.S. position is, or why it is we want to accomplish something, or what it is we want to do together. Reading and speaking, just the most basic things. Being able to sit in the backyard in some place and read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy in the original language, or going to the grocery store or the market, even better, and accurately saying, I want those strawberries and not those strawberries, or just asking questions, building sort of the day-to-day thing so you feel like you're part of a country and a culture in which you're in. And related to that, blending in, feeling that you're not standing out, that you're not an ugly American. In fact, you may be an ugly something, but people don't know it's an American. One of the greatest compliments I ever had was I was on a train in Russia once, and I was talking to some people, and people said, well, you're not exactly from around here, are you? Mm-hmm. Which meant they couldn't identify I was an American. They probably thought I was from the Baltics or someplace, that I had good command, but wasn't exactly from where they were. So it does help you get more accurate impressions because people aren't trying to perform to you as an American. Oh, and the nuance. Lots of times you just can't get that little, I almost want to use a Russian word here, and you know which one it is, donkost, that feel for exactly what it is. And having that language, and the more experience you have with the language and the culture, the better it is you're going to be able to get it. And the richer your life is going to be, and the richer your reporting, your ability to convince, and all those other things. It all sort of begins to meld back forth and mutually reinforce each other. So let me just mention very briefly, again, sort of reemphasize why this is so important. So first of all, embassies and diplomats abroad have two main missions. One is to report back to Washington what's going on, so you can make decisions based on real facts and not just sort of what's out there in the press or what somebody says or listening to some foreign leader, that you get the unbiased view from professional Americans, what's going on in that country and what it means. And then secondly, you want to provide to them the views of the United States. It could be something like, we want you to be our ally in this effort. We want you to stop doing this. Or we want you to produce more of X and less of Y, or we're going to tear off the bejesus out of it. Whatever it is, you've got to be able to explain that. And yes, you can use interpreters, but it's never as good. It never, first of all, it's not you. And second of all, they make mistakes. They don't get the tiny little details aren't always right. And then finally here, before I conclude, just a few anecdotes from my history of language and language use. In 2010, I was back in the Czech Republic. I'd been there from 78 to 81. My Czech was really good. And it sort of came back, and I was using it. And at the 4th of July, which I hosted, I had the president of the country and the foreign minister in the front row out in the garden of the residence there. And I gave remarks in English and in Czech. And the Czech, I swear, eyes were popping because my pronunciation, which is extremely difficult for Americans, was near perfect. And it was the proudest language moment of my life. The next day, I went down to the birthplace of Mahler for the 150th anniversary of Mahler's birth. And there was a little ceremony before we went inside the room where he was born and listened to a concert or recital. And I had checked with the president's office, and they said, we want you to speak English because we want this to be, Mahler was in the United States, and that's why you're there, is the American connection, English, and so forth. So I get up there, and I had a few rough notes as to what I was going to say. And the president of the Czech Republic got up and said, in Czech, he speaks great Czech. Speak Czech.
Yes, right.
So there I was, didn't have my remarks all rehearsed and written down there in Czech. All I had was a few scribbled notes in English. So I started off, and it wasn't as good as the day before, but it was still pretty good. And I was cruising in for the final, and I'll never forget the final sentence. Mahler was born here, but became famous around the entire world. So the last word I was going to speak was world. And as I came cruising in, I realized I could only remember the word for world in Russian. So I used it. And then I said in Czech, that's the wrong language. And everybody laughed. So I guess they knew what I meant. A more serious one was when I was ambassador to Kazakhstan. We had a very embarrassing incident, which I can't tell you what it was. And I was in for a meeting with the president, with some other people. And at the end, he said, I want you to stay behind. So there were just the two of us there on one of the most sensitive issues I have ever dealt with in my entire diplomatic career. And we had the conversation in Russian, where I had to both explain and apologize without apologizing. And it actually seemed to work. So, I guess you can't argue with success. But again, I think without my knowledge and ability and all the years I've been speaking Russian, I never would have been able to do that. Another funny one was Strobe Talbot was visiting Russia, and we had a meeting with Deputy Foreign Minister, who always spoke English. He spoke brilliant English. I almost never heard him speak Russian. And we had another visitor with us, a senior person from Washington who spoke no Russian. So I was the longest the note taker, and I was busily taking notes, and all of a sudden switched to some other topic, and it was clear all of a sudden he was speaking for the microphones because he had a message delivery he wanted the people to understand. So he switched to Russian, and all of a sudden I had to become the simultaneous interpreter for the guy sitting next to me, whispering to him and taking notes at the same time. I'm not sure my notes were as good as the interpreting, but they both the jobs got done. And then the final one, and I've got 32 seconds left here, was that when I was in Bulgaria, a language which I only studied to be able to read and never really got much practice at speaking or doing anything else, I did a live interview on TV on the morning show, and I had this little earpiece, and the interpreter was off camera who was going to interpret the questions into my ear, and then I was going to answer in English, and then she would interpret it. So basically, the audience only heard didn't have to go back and forth. Well, the little earpiece didn't work. But luckily, thanks to my knowledge of Russian and having been around I could at least get enough of the question that I could get the answer into the right ballpark, and I'm not sure anybody knew who was listening that I was not listening to what the interpretation is. So anyway, just a few little lighthearted remarks and anecdotes to finish off this very serious and important conversation about how critically important it is to get language and cultural instruction right in a way that can arm Americans to go abroad and to function at the highest level possible and to accomplish their personal, professional, and diplomatic goals. So again, I can't thank American councils for this, but I can thank all of you as professionals in the field of language, and especially to Betty, who engineered my greatest language learning success. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention to this very, very important topic. Language and area studies discussions very often end up being dominated by area studies issues, understandably. This particular discussion, however, I think we can all agree has focused appropriately on language and kind of summed up ever so nicely by, John, your comments kind of from the field. This is kind of the ultimate professional service validation of all the things we've been talking about. So thank you, John. Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Mike. And thanks, Betty, for your contributions.